Neat to have you. Oh my. Thank you for being here. We're in a study in Matthew chapter 11, and it's always a little quandary of how much to review and to catch you up, and don't want to leave you dangling, but we're kind of in the middle of a study. Wanted to give you the outline that we're dealing with so that you can at least see that and know where we are in the progression. It's gone much slower than I anticipated, but hey, what's new? So we're looking at Matthew chapter 11, and we're going to begin reading again at verse 4. And we're particularly zeroing in on verse 9 tonight. So Matthew chapter 11, verse 9 will be our focus. But of course you need to see it in its context. So we're beginning our reading at verse 4, Matthew chapter 11. Jesus has, of course, trained his disciples. He's called them, and they've been with him for all of this time in the Galilean ministry, and it's been phenomenal. He's been doing all the miracles. He's been doing all the preaching. The whole weight of the ministry has been on him. And in the midst of that, he said, hey, this is getting too big. Too much is happening. We need more people involved in this. I can't carry all of this alone. Too many people with too many needs. So he pulls his disciples aside, has a prayer meeting, and then in the middle of the prayer tells them that he's sending them. And then he gives a whole chapter 10, of instructions on what they are to be like, what's going down in that ministry that he's sending them out to. He's taken what he contains within himself, transferred it to them, and they now have the power to do the same thing he's been doing. So they are going out, and as they go out, after he has instructed them, he is going, according to verse 1, to their cities, which I believe is their hometowns. So he went to their particular hometowns of the 12 and those that were involved, and is preaching in their hometowns, not expecting them to be there. And as he preaches, there is a messenger, two messengers actually, in verse 2 of chapter 11, who come, and it says, when John had heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent two of his disciples and said to him, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? Jesus answered and said to them, go and tell John the things which you hear and see. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended because of me. As they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitude concerning John, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, more than a prophet. Reading verse 9 again. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. Two disciples have come to Jesus from John saying, hey, what's the deal? Are you really the coming one? Have we gotten confused? And Jesus says, go back and tell John what you hear and see. Now, we know according to verse 2 that John had heard in prison about the works of Christ. So that's simply a duplication. Go tell him what you've heard and seen. Well, he's already heard and seen, so we're just telling him, yeah, more miracles, more this. But we've discovered that what's really going on here is that Jesus doesn't send those disciples back immediately. He says, hey, come with me. And they went into the ministry field and actually experienced what was going on. So they were standing around while Jesus was doing miracles, and there was this flow of the Spirit and this dynamic happening, and they sensed the movement of the kingdom of God, and it became a reality. It wasn't just, oh yeah, so-and-so got healed down yonder, but they were there. They saw it, they felt it, they experienced it, and now he said, once you've experienced this, it's gripped your life, you felt the passion of it, you know what's going on, go back and tell him. One thing to quote theology, folks. It's another thing to have a burning heart that says, oh, if you had experienced what I've experienced. if he touched you like he touched me. Theology is okay, but this is more than ideas and more than concepts of the church. This is, hey, good sermons are not enough. We've got to have this movement, this presence, this sense, that's in our lives, in our personal lives, as well as in the church. So he sent them back. So as they've gone back, when they departed, verse 7, Jesus began to say to the multitude concerning John. So Jesus moves in to defend John the Baptist. We've given several reasons why he's defending him, but I don't want to talk about that tonight. I want to talk about, isn't it something to have Jesus defend you? In fact, would it be all right if he were your only defense? Would that be okay with you? If you didn't have to defend yourself, just keep your mouth shut and let him defend you. Would that be okay? Because somebody's going to criticize you. You can count on that. Surprise, surprise, huh? Would it be okay if he was your total defense? If he handled it? And so Jesus is defending John the Baptist. And we're studying that defense. Now I want to give you a little outline of that defense. He begins with this whole idea that we've been walking through of John's personal integrity. He begins to defend John by talking about his personal integrity. And as you look at these verses, down in verse 7 and 8, you see that strongly, the personal integrity of John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind. And we're giving you three ideas from these verses. One is the continued in truth, which is a reed shaken in the wind idea. That John was not some reed that was just blowing back and forth by the wind, and any wave of the thing any blow of the breeze could come and move him. John was absolutely steadfast in the truth. He absolutely would not bend, and when you trace his life from the beginning all the way through, he had been captured by the reality of Christ and would not give that up. Will you do the same? The second idea is that he's clothed in truth. For Jesus turns and says, what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft clothing. There's a contrast set up. The soft clothing of kings and their houses, but also the undercurrent of this is the Pharisees, because he's going to be addressing the Pharisees at the end of this discourse in verse 19. So there's the idea of the dress of the Pharisees contrasted with the dress of John the Baptist. Each one dressed according to their focus. And the contrast is in their focus. What were the Pharisees all about? Well, again, they had this long robe. They had this robe that was actually a square, a piece of cloth that they wrapped around them, and the corners came to the bottom, and they put these tassels on the corners, and the tassels represented the law. So they were surrounded by the law. Their focus was the law. The law, the law. That's all they had. It was a performance-oriented focus. So they had the law as their focus. They had part of their dress was phylacteries. It was a little pouch in which they wrote out a law and put it in that phylactery. They had two of them, one on their forearm that was closest to their heart, one on their forehead that would be close to the throbbing temple. So they had the law close to their bloodstream. It was the law, the law. Their whole focus was that. Their dress bespoke their focus. What's old John the Baptist's focus? Well, it's certainly not on dress, folks. He's got camel skin, Matthew says in chapter 3, camel skin, a loincloth of camel skin, and he eats wild honey and locusts. That's the sum total of the description, because his focus is on Jesus and Jesus alone, and that determined his dress. So John had one single focus. I want to propose to you that your focus will determine how you dress. Not only was he clothed in truth, but he was content in truth, which is verse 8, and we talked about that last week. He is content in truth. For he says again, what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments. Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. See, he's not in the line of kings' houses. He has no political agenda. He has no undercurrent. He's content with just the proclamation and the embracing of truth. He isn't lining his pockets. We talked about the materialism thing. He's not taking the offerings home in a paper bag. There's no personal gain in this. It's the risk of his life. Here's a man who is absolutely, totally focused on one single thing, and nothing else matters to him. And of course, that one single thing is Jesus. Would you be the same? Would you be the same? Now in the next section, he moves into what we're calling John's prophetic instruction. And in this is verse 9, but what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. And then he quotes this prophecy. For this is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. So the whole focus of this section is the prophetic emphasis. So he's defending John the Baptist by bringing up the fact that John is a prophet who has been prophesied about, which is a double prophecy, which is really neat. Not only is he a prophet, but he is a fulfillment of prophecy. So it's a double thrust, which I think is phenomenal, and we'll get into that. But in this, there's a threefold breakdown that we're going to be dealing with, and obviously this will take us 3 Saturday nights to do. One is the proclamation, which we're going to talk about tonight. The other is the preparation, which is in the prophecy of verse 10, and then the participation, which is in verse 11. So we want to go tonight to talk about the proclamation. Again, verse 9. I love this verse. What did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes! 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 He was a prophet. Now, the rest of the verse we'll do another time, but that's where we want to stop tonight. You'll note that he starts in the verse, in my translation, with the word but. The contrasting conjunction. It's a little misleading because if you back up in verse 8, you'll see it again. So, but what did you go out to see? But what did you go out to see? Verse 8 and 9. Like there's a contrast going on. But it's a different Greek word than the normal contrasting conjunction that's translated but. That Greek word is normally de, which is de, but that's not this word. This is alla, which is a whole different emphasis. So don't come to this passage with the idea that he's setting up a series of contrasts. Now you can bend it to fit that, but that's not what he's doing. In other words, you could contrast, here is men clothed in soft garments, here's John the Baptist, and you got this contrast going on. So there you can make a contrast out of it, but that's not his emphasis in the passage, and if you do that, you'll get confused in what he's trying to say. The thrust of what he's trying to say with this beginning word, this conjunction alla, is the idea of not a contrast, but a transitional term. In fact, the best way to translate it is the word moreover. In other words, it's a whole series of statements. And it's like he's building. I'm starting here, but let me add this to it. Let me add this one to it. Let me add this one to it. And it's like a lawyer building a case, stacking one piece of evidence on top of another. So as you look at the series of statements, you see that. What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind. Or let me add this too. Moreover, what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments. Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. Moreover, let me add this one to it now. Hey, I've got your attention, haven't I? Moreover, what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes! So he's stacking these things one on top of another, building this overwhelming case of the defense of the prophetic ministry of John the Baptist. Now, along with that, which we've already emphasized in verse 9, you'll note the word yes. What did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes! Which is the idea of certainly. In other words, it's not a negative. It's not a, oh yeah, it's not a joke. It's not a under tear. It's not a tearing him down. It's, yes, he is a prophet. If you went out to see a prophet, you're dead on. This man was a prophet. I'm telling you, the prophet of prophets. This guy was a real prophet. You haven't seen one for 400 years, but this guy showed up, and when you laid your eyes on him, you laid your eyes on a prophet. This boy, indeed, I'm telling you, certainly, no question about it. There was no doubt at all. He's a prophet. Now, he's going to go on and say more than a prophet, which is a whole other study. But he is a prophet. So that foundation is laid that John indeed is a prophet. Now, another word that's really important in the statement is, what did you go out to see? A prophet. You need to know what a prophet is. Now, when you come to the New Testament, the idea of the prophet changed radically. So you've got an Old Testament, Old Covenant concept of the prophet. You've got a New Testament, New Covenant concept of the prophet. And they're not the same. There's some similarities as they are tied together, but you don't dare confuse the two concepts. For instance, the Apostle Paul talked about the gifts of the Spirit. And as he talked about the gifts of the Spirit in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, he said, God has given some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be pastors, some to be teachers. And in that category of ministry abilities, there to equip the saints, there is this category of the prophet. Now, as you begin to study in the early church, you'll find out that the prophet was more of an instructor, teacher kind of guy who was next to the apostles. You realize the apostles disappeared because they were the eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus and of his life. That was one of the requirements, that you had to be there the whole time from the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist all the way through to his ascension. You could be an apostle. When that group died off, apostleship literally, the real apostle, literally faded away. You look mad because you thought you were one, right? Yeah, they faded away because nobody could take that place in that sense, the technical term of the apostle. Next to them is this prophet guy. He is an itinerant individual, that meaning he travels around, homeless. He's traveling around from place to place, teaching and instructing. He's on a higher level of instruction than the normal teacher because he has a whole different style than the normal teacher. The style of the normal teacher was methodical, was mundane, was get the information out, was, give you a test kind of teaching. The prophet was probably a yeller, probably talk loud a lot. Why are you looking at me? He was probably an individual who was emotional. He probably was an individual who often operated on inspiration and did things that didn't quite make sense sometimes. The prophet, what a guy. New Testament sense. But when you come to the Old Testament, by the way, Jesus is talking here about John the Baptist being a prophet. Now, nothing I've said relates to John the Baptist, because John the Baptist was the last of the Old Testament prophets. Can you imagine? From Moses to the Babylonian captivity, they had these prophets. There weren't too many of them. You could count them on your hands. These guys that showed up and were real prophets, selected by God. There was nothing about them that was consistent. What I mean by that is they didn't have any kind of heritage where they were all from the same tribe, or they all had a certain education, or they all had certain prophetic degrees, or they didn't have any special training. Some were rich, some were poor, some were good looking, some weren't, some were educated, some weren't educated. It was just like out of the blue, God came along and tapped guys on the shoulder and said, hey, I'm picking you. And God did something in these guys that made them prophets. The word prophet is two words put together. Literally the idea of pro, which means to forth, to bring forth, to before kind of thing. And the other word to tell, which is the idea of then to tell before it happens. So the prophet, the primary role of the prophet was this foretelling, but connected with the foretelling in the Old Testament was this idea of warning. In other words, God would come along to a guy and say, listen, these guys are headed for real trouble. This is going to be awful. Man, something bad is going to happen. He would lay it out what was going to happen. Now go warn them. Okay, repent. Stop this thing. Back up on this. Reverse your tread. Hey, don't go down that road. Hey, guys, listen to me. So the prophet would go up against kings. The prophet would go up against the popularity of his hour. The prophet wasn't interested in being accepted. He would pop up in the middle of town and lay out this message and say, guys, God is warning us. There's something. Oh, do you know what's just about to happen? But you can stop this thing if we will just repent and let God do something in our lives. He'll turn this thing around. People, this is what we've got to do. That was a prophet. Now you realize if the prophet started with Moses and went all the way through to the Babylonian captivity, that was 400 years before this time period. So they haven't seen a prophet for 400 years, folks. This is phenomenal. For 400 years they've not seen a prophet. And all of a sudden John the Baptist shows up. He's the valedictorian of all prophets. Woo! He's the last one. He stands on the shoulders of all the other prophets. In fact, Jesus is going to go on to say he's the most valuable man that's ever been born. He is a phenomenal individual. He's the greatest man that's ever been born. This guy, this prophet, John the Baptist. Here he stands, John the Baptist, the prophet, an amazing man. Now in that prophecy, there is this role that he's going to play. What is the role of this prophet? Well, we want to talk about three things as we try to get into this passage and unfold this thing. One is the fact of phone. You thought it was phone, didn't you? I know you did. We've talked about phone before, and while Jesus gives a prophecy about John the Baptist, which is found in verse 10, which is not our consideration tonight, he gives this prophecy quoted out of Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. He gives this prophecy. Matthew in chapter 3 gives us another prophecy to introduce John the Baptist. And Matthew's prophecy that he quotes is out of Isaiah. And the prophecy that Isaiah gives us about John the Baptist is one you're familiar with. He's the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Now the Greek word for voice is the word phone. So he says, John the Baptist is the phone crying in the wilderness. The Greek word for phone is where we get our word phone, telephone, which means instrument. Sometimes it's translated noise. Sometimes it's translated racket. Sometimes it's translated sound of horses' hooves. There's a variety of translations for it, but it basically has the idea of the instrument through which the idea or the noise or the sound of what's going on is portrayed. So John the Baptist came along, and he is called by the Old Testament prophet, he is called the phone, the telephone through which God is delivering his message. Oh, thank God for cell phones. Do you ever see a guy talking on a cell phone? He's talking away, and he's just getting louder and louder and louder.
And he's just getting more aggravated, and he's walking back and forth, and he's stomping around, and he's just so aggravated. And finally, he just takes the phone, and he just throws it against the wall. Why would he do that? The telephone did not invent the message. You just wasted a good $150, $200 phone that you're going to have to replace, and the phone had nothing to do with it. It is an instrument through which the message came. Don't kick the messenger. Not my fault. Idea. The whole idea of John the Baptist is he is a telephone. This is not his deal. He didn't invent this. He isn't giving his personal interpretation or opinion of this. This isn't what he wanted to say or didn't want to say. His will, his desires, his emotions, how he felt about this wasn't in play on this. This was a divine appointment by a divine God who is using him like a telephone to say something through him. Do you know how strong this is in the Old Testament? Example, there was this prophet by the name of Balaam. There was this king by the name of Balak. Balak was a king over the Moabites. Israel was camping outside the Moabite territory, and all the rumors of what the God of Israel did when Israel showed up scared this Balak king to death. So he decided, I'm going to get a prophet of Israel to curse the Israelites. Good luck on that. So he gets all this money, and there's a long story on this, but he gets all this money and propositions Balaam, the prophet of God. And Balaam says up front, I want to tell you, I can only let come out of my mouth what God wants to come out of my mouth. I'm telling you up front. I'll take your money. But listen, I can only say what God wants me to say. He says, I want the Israelites cursed. So he gives him all this money. He goes out, stands on the hillside overlooking Israel, raises his hands, and is trying to curse the Israelites, but blessings come out. Why? Because he's a prophet, and a prophet can't say anything that God doesn't want him to say. Oh, wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great if I could just kneel at the altar and God would just fix my mouth? And I can only say what he wants me to say. From this point on. So everything that comes out of my mouth, wait a minute. He's pulled off something better than that. You know what this new covenant is all about? This new covenant is about God not fixing my mouth, man. You know what this new covenant is about? God comes and does something in my inner heart, so what comes out of my mouth is what he wants to come out of my mouth because it comes from within. You didn't get that. He isn't going to fix my mouth, so inside I want to curse the Israelites, bless God. I want to curse them, but I can't. It isn't that. He's going to change my inside so that blessings want to spill out and I don't take the king's money in the first place. Wow. This is not a mechanical fixing of the mouth. This is a change of the nature. This is not a pressure. If you do, I'll get you. This is an inside motivation from within that just desires to. This is an inside movement of a divine God within the human heart that literally captivates our very being and spills his will through us. Do you believe it's Do you believe it's possible to be so filled with him, for him to literally go to the depth of your life and literally cause you to be a phone? Do you think it's possible to be so intimate with him that you become a telephone, literally bringing forth the message? Oh. I want that. I want that. But not only was he a phone, there's this whole idea of passion that's in the passage and in the prophecies that are given about John the Baptist, the idea of passion. The prophet idea just bespeaks the idea of passion, because the prophet was a guy who had this authority, and he had this burn in his bones. And again, he went up against kings, and he couldn't be thwarted. You couldn't stop him. He was fearless. He had this message, and he just couldn't let it down. He had this truth that had so gripped him, it boiled in his system. It just had to be spoken. He couldn't hide in the corner. He couldn't let it go. He was pushed. He had this thumb in his back. He was blazing with this overwhelming passion. He burned. Again, he had to risk his life. He stood up against these kings. This had to be, just could not tolerate if it wasn't done. In the prophecy that Matthew gave in chapter 3, verse 3, it's a voice, the phone, the voice, the telephone, crying, 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 crying. Not whispering. See, loud preaching is so biblical. Crying. Because how could you whisper when you got this burn inside? How could you whisper when there's this raging, this truth has got to be heard? How can you keep still when you got this push within that just won't leave you alone? And this passion begins to show up in the prophet. Now, it's interesting that when you look at verse, there was a contrast I wanted you to see in the words to see. If you look at verse 8, what did you go out to see? Really interesting. It's given to us again in verse 7. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? Verse 8. What did you go out to see? Verse 9. What did you go out to see? So it's presented to us 3 times. In verse 7, it's a different word than is given to us in verse 8 and in verse 9, which is so phenomenal. The Greek word that's translated to see in verse 7 is one we've talked about, which is the idea of theater. It's where we get our word theater. So it's the idea of entertainment. It's the idea of spectacular. It's the idea of show. It's the idea of a drama. It's the idea of something unusual taking place. So he's saying, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? This theater, this drama on a stage, this production, this musical, this entertaining thing. Is that what you went out to see? Then he follows it up by changing words on us in verse 8. But what did you go out to see? And in see, it's oida, which is the idea of perceive and grasp. He says, I'll tell you what happened. You went out, first of all, you went out because you were captivated by the theater idea, by the entertainment of it. You heard about John the Baptist and a prophet and the kind of guy he was and the theatrics he put on, and you went out to see all of that. But wait a minute, the burn, the passion which attracted you in the first place, it all began to change. And what began to change in you was you began to grasp, you began to understand, you began to perceive what his message was. And it gripped you. We hope we're entertaining. But sometime in the middle of all of that, there's got to be the movement of the Spirit of God that brings us into perception and understanding, where we begin to grasp. So he ends up saying, did you not go out and begin to understand and grasp that behind all the passion is this overwhelming truth that drives the man. Do you have that? Well, sure you do. Sure you do. You've got passion. I've seen some of your passion. What is it that turns you on? What is it that just... What is it that sets you on your heels? What is it that just makes you want to stand up and... Do you believe it's possible that Jesus could go to the depth of your heart and become your one single passion? You're mouthy about lots of things. Wouldn't it be something to be a mouthy about him and him alone? Well, this is what I believe. Wouldn't it be something if you were so captured that he's the only thing you believe? And wouldn't that be the eternal thing? I mean, you fluctuate on what upsets you. And what your passion is changes in your life because you get old and can't. But passion for him, I promise you, burns and burns and continues to burn. And it's the only thing that has eternal value to it. This is worth giving your life to. Quickly, there's a third thing. The parallel. Interesting we're talking about the prophet. He's defending John the Baptist as a prophet. And he says, there is this parallel with Jesus. It's phenomenal. Between John the Baptist and Jesus. This parallel works its way through all the life and the teachings of John the Baptist. One is John the Baptist is a forerunner, which already sets it up, because Jesus then is the Messiah that he is forerunning for. So he's setting up the foundation for the coming of the Christ and the kingdom. Right in our passage, Jesus says that John the Baptist was eating and drinking, verse 18. John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking. That was John's style. Hey, honey and wild locusts, wild honey and locusts, that was his whole deal. So he's eating, and he didn't come eating, and he didn't come drinking. And they said he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they said he's a winebibber and a gluttonous man. So he always had supper on Saturday night. So here's the eating and drinking over against the not eating and drinking, parallel, contrast. John the Baptist's ministry was in the desert. Jesus' ministry was in the three major cities, he said, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum. He did most of his mighty works in the three major cities, according to this chapter 11. John the Baptist baptized thousands of people in revival. Jesus baptized no one, according to John. Only his disciples baptized. John the Baptist's birth was a miraculous birth. His parents were too old to give birth to a child, and God granted them a son. Jesus was a miraculous birth. Virgin, born of a virgin. God intervened in both of their births. John the Baptist was a phone, telephone. Jesus is the Logos. John the Baptist is the voice, the phone. Jesus is the Logos, the Word. See, the Word is the idea, the rational thought process, the idea that's in the mind and the heart of God. John the Baptist is the instrument through which that is proclaimed. Jesus is that which is being proclaimed. He's the actual idea acted out, lived out, moving, functioning, operating. Phenomenal contrast. John the Baptist, the phone, the voice. Jesus, the word. John the Baptist is the announcement about. Jesus is the content of the announcement itself. John the Baptist says, hey, listen to me. Jesus is what you are to listen to, what you should hear. John the Baptist says, pay attention. Jesus is the message you are to pay attention to. Again, the logos, the word concept, is that which is the rational, logical, intelligent idea and thought process. John is speaking, the voice, the instrument through which that is being sounded. Ladies and gentlemen, if I understand anything about Christianity, it is the fact that you and I are to be the expression, the instrument through which the message is portrayed. Hey, I believe in witnessing on the plane to a guy you've never seen. Hey, that's great. I believe in witnessing to the guy down the street. You tell him about Jesus. Hey, that's all fine. But the finality, the bottom line of the whole business of the evangelism and the message and moving our community is that none of that does any good eventually unless somebody lives that before the individual. I, living the message of Jesus before you, then earn the right to be the voice through which his message speaks so that you grasp it. And it's the lived outness of the whole thing that really matters. John was the lived out message, and we saw, and Jesus was the message that was lived out. Jesus, the desperate need in my life is for you to fill and so captivate me that there would be a parallel between my life and John the Baptist. Oh, if I could be so filled with you that I could be an instrument through which you could speak. If I could be so filled with you that you would be my one passion, my one burn, you would captivate me. If I could be so filled with you that the rational thought of your person, the essence of your love and nature, would literally dance through my life and display itself to my world. Oh God, we don't need more sermons. We need lives who portray who you are. Could you fix our tongues? No, no, no. Don't fix our tongues. Would you fix our natures until our tongue obeys? Heads are bowed. Let me ask you, are you pleased with your expression? Of who he is? You satisfied with your life's expression? Someone asked, if you were taken to court and accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict? What's your passion level? For Him? You can't turn that on. You can't make that happen. You can't make yourself get excited about Jesus. The beat of the music can thrill you. But it takes Jesus to be gripped by truth. What's your passion level for Him? Could He do something in you? Moments of seeking. Altars open.